has convened a closed meeting on this date pursuant to an affirmative recorded vote and in accordance with the provisions of the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, and whereas Section 2.2-3712 of the Code of Virginia requires a certification by City Council that such closed meeting was conducted in conformity with Virginia law, now therefore be it resolved that the Council of the City of Lynchburg certifies that to the best of each member's knowledge, only public business matters lawfully exempted from open meeting requirements by Virginia law were discussed in the closed meeting to which the certification resolution applies, and only such public business matters as were identified in the motion convening the closed meeting were heard, discussed, or considered by council. Motion on the certification, please. All right, thank you. Councilmember Hagelson and Wilder. And please cast your vote. Thank you, and the motion passes 7-0, and thank you for reopening to the public. Phew, it's hot. All right, thank you all for stepping out, and we will continue on for the discussion regarding zoning ordinance amendments for short-term rental uses. And I'll turn to Ms. Severcek.
Thank you, Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of council. Back in mid-May, May 14th of this year, you held a public hearing on proposed zoning ordinance amendments for short-term rental uses and requested that this come back to you with some answers to questions that you had and be discussed later this summer. And that time has arrived, and Deputy City Manager Reed Wotica and Community Development Director Kent White are here to make that presentation.
Yes, ma'am. So I have a number of just really quick comments that I wanted to make just to point out. So the main reason we're having this conversation is that with respect to short-term rentals, we are operating ultimately under a zoning interpretation rather than a very clear ordinance. And so as this process goes along, we hope that we will ultimately end up with a very clear definition of what our policies are that we can codify that are very clear. So ultimately what this means right now is that the operators and neighbors of short-term rentals throughout the city really don't have anywhere they can go to see precisely what the rules are and what we're supposed to be doing. So ultimately they have to call community development to get some idea. So hopefully whatever the policy decisions are made, we will be able to get some very clear understanding of what the rules are in the city with respect to short-term rentals as we move forward. As the city manager says, we've prepared answers to a number of questions that either you all posed or members of the public posed during the public hearing, and my colleague Kent White will provide those answers.
Thank you, Mr. Woke. Madam Mayor, Madam Vice Mayor, members of council, good afternoon. Hope you're doing well. The purpose of this afternoon's discussion is to really briefly review some of the data that we have on short-term rentals as it applies to Lynchburg, answer the questions that Ms. Severcek and Mr. Wotica mentioned, and provide you with a recommendation as well as a couple of alternatives to implement a short-term rental registration program. So you recall the chart on the right is data that we have from 2018 that estimated short-term rentals represent approximately 10% of the city's total lodging revenue. And then back in May, we asked Host Compliance, which is a third-party monitoring site, to provide an updated assessment of short-term rentals in the city. That spot assessment identified 483 individual rental units, resulting in 529 rental listings. This was up from the 365 units, 403 listings that were previously identified in August of 2018. The estimated median nightly rate also increased to $77 from $75. Approximately 3/4 of the units were single-family homes that rented the entire house. This latter data that talks specifically about the nightly rates, it's important to note that that's derived from an algorithm which pulls in known data from similar cities and applies that to Lynchburg. So there is some variability with that. And obviously that illustrates the difficulty with proving the number of times that the unit is rented, the amount of charge. Certainly, as you know, digital platforms have created an opportunity for residents to showcase Lynchburg to the world. Short-term rentals increase lodging choice and create opportunities for individuals to generate additional income, as well as highlight distinct areas of our city. Conversely, short-term rentals have raised questions of fairness. Our 22 hotels and 4 bed and breakfast establishments permitted to operate in the city must obtain business licenses and remit all taxes associated with their business, including lodging tax. Neighborhood impacts are also a concern. Some of the reported issues include transiency, occupancy, parking, noise, and trash, to name a few. Last year, City Council twice discussed local government's authority to regulate short-term rentals, and at the conclusion of your October 23rd work session, you directed staff to prepare ordinance amendments that balance the opportunities and the issues associated with this use. Once staff prepared the amendments, Planning Commission subsequently held 4 meetings, including 2 public hearings, and spoke with numerous operators and neighbors in formulating their ordinance recommendations to City Council. Although their recommendation was not unanimous, they reached consensus on the majority of the ordinance provisions through lots of debate and compromise. Highlights of the ordinance that we presented to you in May are as follows. Short-term rentals would be allowed by right in all residential and commercial districts, as well as the institutional 2 zoning district. In lower density residential neighborhoods, the building used as a short-term rental must be the operator's primary residence. Occupancy would be limited to 4 unrelated guests, notwithstanding provisions of the building code, an unlimited number of related guests could stay. An additional parking space would be required for each unit, except in B4 zoning districts where there are no parking requirements. Structures must meet building code, and those units in lower density neighborhoods must maintain the appearance of homes. The proposed ordinance also requires all operators to register, pay a $150 registration fee, and allows the city to prohibit the use of the rental for 3 code violations related to the short-term rental use in 3 years. There would be a $500 penalty if the operator does not register their unit. So that's our review of the data. From here, Mr. Martin, Mr. Knuckles, and I want to begin walking through the questions that were raised at that May 14th hearing, starting with, does state code allow the city to adopt this ordinance? In short, yes. The code section on the screen defines a short-term rental, allows localities to create a registry and require operators to register annually and or pay a fee at the locality's discretion, exempts realtors or those represented by a real estate licensee or provisions of the Timeshare Act from registering, allows penalties for not registering, and allows the locality to prohibit the host from renting if the unit has 3 violations of local or state ordinances. The code section does not limit local government's land use controls or its zoning authority. And there was some confusion about this, and it was resulted, we believe, from a few speakers referencing a Senate Bill 416 from the 2016 General Assembly section. This bill was more restrictive than the bill that was ultimately adopted into law by the General Assembly in 2017. So how are complaints addressed based on our current policy? As Mr. Wodica stated, that we're currently working under the interpretation of the zoning administrator. That interpretation states that these uses are permitted by right in business districts. In residential zone districts, it defaults to the city occupancy standards in the zoning ordinance, and the operator must be present during the guest's stay. As you know, our zoning cases are handled on a complaint basis, and occupancy complaints continue to be the most challenging to prove and often require significant staff research and court proceedings to address. No matter the outcome of the investigation, it is a staff-intensive and time-consuming process. Although the number of short-term rental cases is relatively low in comparison to other zoning issues, it's important to note that the city may receive multiple complaints on a particular property. So typically those complaints are addressed through the same initial case. We don't create a new case for every zoning complaint on the same property. So for example, we referenced that there were 11 zoning cases in 2018, but some of those, of course, were based on multiple complaints against the property. A question was raised about how the proposed ordinance would improve zoning enforcement. First and foremost, as stated, it would lay out the rules very clearly, for not just for operators, but for guests and for neighbors. Everyone would understand the same things that we're talking about. Right now, they have to call the zoning administrator. Second, the registry would provide the location information about the rental units, so staff would know where they were operating. And while many short-term rental operators address zoning violations very quickly when they're brought to their attention, occasionally units have recurring issues that staff have to address through the courts. The registry would allow staff to address units that repeatedly violate the ordinance without taking each violation to court individually. So the process for that would be that staff would continue to provide that initial verbal warning that we do for the violation. If that wasn't heeded, then there would be a written notice of violation. Under the new ordinance, if the rental received 3 of those written notices of violations in 3 years, the city could prohibit the use. Operators who felt the notice was issued incorrectly would still be able to appeal through the Board of Zoning Appeals and or through the courts as they prefer. So you also had a question about prohibiting the short-term rentals in low-density residentials and the potential impacts of that. Staff estimates that there are hundreds of short-term rentals that are currently operating in the lower density neighborhoods, those R1 and R2 zoning districts. If council prohibited the use in those neighborhoods, staff would need to understand if the expectation was to proactively enforce this or address on a complaint basis. But either way, this would potentially be a huge endeavor that the city does not currently have resources to enforce. I mean, you'd be talking about stopping hundreds of existing uses right now. And not to mention, probably the State Games of America are a great example, where when all of our hotel rooms filled up, you'd be reducing the lodging options that are currently available in the city. A lot of those folks stayed in short-term rentals and stayed in the city. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Martin, who's going to talk about questions that were related to occupancy in neighborhoods.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of council. I'm going to talk with you over the next few slides. First being, why does the short-term ordinance allow 4 people instead of 3? The first version of the proposed short-term rental ordinance that was presented to the Planning Commission did limit the occupancy to no more than 3. This was consistent with the existing zoning ordinance and would have kept it consistent with the long-term rentals. The topic was discussed at length during the 2 public hearings and numerous work sessions that the Planning Commission held. However, the Planning Commission recommended that the number be changed to no more than 4 unrelated individuals in a short-term rental, so that 2 couples could stay in a short-term rental together. They also talked about knitting clubs and those types of groups that would rent a short-term rental. So the number was chosen to provide some flexibility for short-term rentals, and staff does not see it as arbitrary because it was supported by thought, it was supported by logic and reason, and why that number was chosen. The proposed ordinance also does not limit the number of related individuals who may occupy a short-term rental, just as the long-term ordinance does not prohibit the number of related people that can occupy. However, there is one distinction in the ordinance today for long-term rentals in that it allows 1 unrelated person when 2 or more related people reside in a unit. If the City Council would want to add that provision so that there were related people and wanted to have an unrelated guest, we would need to do that in the ordinance. So that proposed provision is not in the short-term rental ordinance that is before you this evening. Some very elementary drawings here to try and show you the difference between the occupancy standards. The first on the left is an owner-occupied dwelling with an accessory unit. So in the city's zoning districts now, if your structure is owner-occupied, you are allowed an accessory dwelling. It can't look any different than a single-family home. It has to maintain that appearance, but you can rent your basement, for instance, as another unit. In that unit today, in your main unit, you could have related plus one on the top, and you could rent your bottom accessory unit to no more than 3 unrelated people or related plus one. The next slide just shows a non-owner occupied dwelling unit. Because it's not owner occupied, you do not get that accessory unit. So that unit is permitted to have no more than 3 unrelated individuals or related plus one. Moving forward to what's proposed for short-term rental, owner-occupied dwelling units in the RC, R1, and R2 districts, you see the related plus one on the top being grayed out. And the reason I grayed that out for you is to indicate that they did not have to be present while the unit is being used for short-term rental, but it does have to be owner-occupied, and we'll talk about what that means a little bit later. While it's owner-occupied, they could rent it out to no more than 4 unrelated individuals or any number of related individuals. In the R3, R4, and our business districts, any unit could be related to 4 unrelated people or any number of related individuals. So moving forward, I want to talk a little bit about the differences on what a bed and breakfast is and how it relates to short-term rentals. It's important to understand that a bed and breakfast in the zoning ordinance is not deemed a home occupation. A bed and breakfasts also require conditional use permit approval from City Council in residential districts after public hearings. So the neighbors get a chance to come and give their input on these proposed uses. They also require at least 1 parking space per bedroom. The primary use of the home shall remain a residence. Business and lodging taxes are also required, and the bed and breakfast must be managed by the occupants of the building. So there is a managing occupant of the bed and breakfast on site. I would like to point out the information that was originally given to you had the R1 and R2 districts reversed. I believe there was a hard copy put on your in front of you. But the R1 and R2 district allows up to 3 rooms with no more than 2 people per room, so that's 6 transient guests, while the R3 and R4 districts allow up to 5 rooms with 4 persons per room for a total of 20. So as the residential district becomes a higher density, the number of rooms increases. Bed and breakfasts are permitted by right in the city's commercial districts. Again, they are required to get a business license and remit lodging tax. So hotels are contain over 5 rooms. They're much larger. They're not required to have a resident manager. They're permitted by right in the city's B3, B4, B5, and I&2 districts. They do require approval of a conditional use permit in the I1 district, which is our restricted industrial district. Much larger scale, requires 1 space per room. Business and lodging taxes are also required. Hotels do not require a resident manager. So how is owner defined as it relates to owner occupancy? To understand owner occupancy, you have to look at 3 different definitions. 2 of these definitions are defined in the zoning ordinance. Those are person and owner. And the third, occupied, is defined by Merriam-Webster, because our zoning ordinance says that if a word is not specifically defined in the ordinance, you go to Merriam-Webster. And there's a specific addition that the zoning administrator has in his office, and you go to that and you have to look up occupied. So after reading the three definitions, owner occupancy would be interpreted as any person or public-private entity with fee simple title that resides as the owner permanently or continuously as one's legal domicile. So the proposed ordinance as it's written today prohibits short-term rentals in the low-density residential districts unless the structure is owner-occupied. It's very unlikely that an entity other than an individual owner would reside in a dwelling. This would prohibit corporate entities from purchasing multiple residents in the city's lower density residential neighborhoods and converting them to strictly short-term rental. This provision is intended to protect the city's low-density neighborhoods from being used largely for transient dwelling purposes, similar to how our low-density neighborhoods are protected from business uses. Airbnb deserts are neighborhoods that have greater than 10% residential space limited on a short-term basis. We haven't defined this as an issue in Lynchburg yet. Other areas of the country has. This can impact the character of neighborhoods and even housing affordability. Often landlords can receive more rent per day than they could get from a permanent renter. This often drives up rents in long-term rentals, which can significantly benefit the operators, but can diminish affordability in our local neighborhoods. When we talk about neighborhoods, we need to look at what our comprehensive plan says. The Comprehensive Plan 2013-2030 lists a city of strong neighborhoods as a guiding principle of the vision. Specifically, the comprehensive plan says the city's reputation as a good place to live and work will grow from the quality of its many neighborhoods with their distinctive characters, histories, and natural settings. Lynchburg neighborhoods will provide residents safe, healthy environments and strong senses of identity and ownership. Our short-term rental ordinance, the way it's proposed to you today, would help maintain that sense of ownership in our low-density residential districts. You heard throughout the public hearing process that short-term rentals are described as being self-regulating. This may be true for the actual renter and the operator. However, it is a little bit less likely for neighbors of the short-term rental units. There is an Airbnb platform for neighbors to raise concern. However, it is very unclear on how, when, and if the concern is ever raised or gets to the operator of the short-term rental. Typically, local government is left to deal with the complaints and occupancy standards. Does the Airbnb platform perform background checks? Typically, they do not. They reserve the right to do so, but typically, other than verifying the identity at the time that the guest registers, there's no background checks that are performed. And that leads us to homeowners associations. It was stated that during the public hearings and public meetings that, well, if neighborhoods do not want to have short-term rentals, they can simply put in place a homeowners association. This is very unrealistic for a neighborhood that has already developed. Typically, homeowners associations are put in place prior to anything being built. When someone's purchasing in a neighborhood, they know they are buying into a homeowners associations and the restrictions that go along with that. This can be anything from managing common areas to architecture, or if they wanted to, for a brand new development, they could prohibit short-term rentals. However, it is very unrealistic that you're going to get 100% of any neighborhood to buy into creating a homeowners association. So again, this is just not very likely to occur. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Mitch Knuckles, and he's going to talk to you about registration and tax collection options.
guess an existing homeowners association could make a change to their regulations if they chose to do so.
Yes, but they would have to get 100% buy-in.
Still 100% too? Okay, thanks.
All right.
Madam Mayor, member of council, I'm Mitch Knuckles. I'm here to cover the registration and tax collection options. The original proposal you had was a registration fee, and as it's been explained, registration fees can only be used to offset the cost to the city, and it was proposed as a way to recoup some of the staff costs. The majority of that cost have been in the Community Development Department to set up the registry and whatnot, and create some equity with the lodging industry. The proposed fee would cover the equivalent of 30 days lodging tax for a host. The concerns raised over that was about the high startup costs might exclude some folks from entering the market, and the occasional rentals, it may exceed the amount of money they actually collected. Is the $150 annual registration fee excessive to cover staff's cost? Oh, am I supposed to be clicking that? My bad. The city estimates its cost at $51,000, and that is primarily $13,000 of that is made up from the cost for host compliance to actually get the data. $10,000 is associated with the Commissioner Revenue Office, and that's for the ones done by the management companies and realtors, and then $28,000 is in the Community Development Department. And that's, again, to create the database and the registration and collection of the tax. Third-party monitoring is not used to identify the STRs. It would definitely acquire additional staff. The host compliance is a key part of anything we decide to do because they provide us with the details that we need. Are realtors exempt from the registry, and what requirements do they have? The state code exempts the following from the registry. It's persons licensed by the Real Estate Board, property owners represented by a real estate licensee, persons registered with Virginia Real Estate Timeshare Act, entities licensed or registered with the Department of Health for provision of room space for lodging, and persons or entities registered with the locality related to the rental or management of real property, hotels, motels, campgrounds, etc. These entities must remit the lodging tax and all the other associated business taxes. What about the security of data used by a third party? This question was brought up about security of folks' information. Host compliance and the data they even already provided to us, that was information they garnered from the GIS, from our own service, not anything the city provided to them, but information they garnered. So all that's already available to the public. All right, here we go with the lovely numbers, which is probably why I'm doing this part. Original proposal of a registration fee, and that was based on $150 being the total charge, which was 30 nights at the average rate of $77 and the 6.5% lodging tax. So you come up with the $45,000 in collected, the $51,000 in costs, so you're looking at a negative $6,000 in the return on investment. Why don't we just charge the STR operators the lodging tax? Taxes are definitely a revenue source that can be used for purposes other than offsetting city cost. Collecting lodging tax from short-term rentals is equitable with the lodging industry. Some platforms now even provide statements of revenue on a monthly basis, Airbnb being one of those. Staff does not recommend requiring hosts to voluntarily remit lodging tax due to low collection rates experienced by other localities in the states and difficulty in determining the rental receipts and the need for additional staff to assist with collection. Providing for the voluntary remittance of lodging tax without additional staff necessary to determine the receipts would create disparities among the short-term rentals. What about an exception for the infrequent occurrences? It was, 3 times or 4 times or whatnot. Offering that exception for the registration fee or the lodging tax remittance with infrequent occurrences will be very difficult since the city does not have the ability to determine the individual nights a short-term rental is actually occupied or rented. God bless you. And this is alternative one, lodging tax and the return on investment estimate. And as you can see, the 6.5% lodging tax, $1 per night with no registration fee, $77 nightly rental, 30 nights, $87,000. We would anticipate a 15% collection rate, so we're looking at collecting $13,000 with the cost of $51,000 and a negative ROI of $38,000. And then this is with additional staff in the commissioner's office, which would actually be almost 1 FTE to assist with administering this. The revenue does raise to $65,000, but unfortunately the costs have increased to $91,000 and a negative $26,000 in return on investment. And is there an alternative for collecting lodging tax that is less staff intensive? And the answer to that is yes. But Airbnb is currently the only platform that offers for the voluntary collection of the monies for localities. Now, it's estimated that 96% of our folks are actually operated through the Airbnb portal. The agreement allows Airbnb to collect the locality's lodging tax as part of the guest reservation process. Airbnb then remits the money directly to the city. Staff initially, me included, had concerns with this process because Airbnb does not allow the city to audit their collections and does not release information about its hosts. But effective July the 1st, it just went into effect, Airbnb is now remitting sales tax to the Commonwealth of Virginia. The ability to compare lodging tax received and sales tax allows us a way of backing into those numbers for the locality. So it's a little more comfort level with that. And as you can see, alternative two, Airbnb agreement and no registration fee. So we're looking at $84,000 in income, $51,000 in cost. Return on investment is a positive $33,000. And we contacted City of Alexandria, and Alexandria estimated they would realize about $100,000 from, they're one of the localities that had done the Airbnb agreement. And they had estimated they would generate about $100,000 in lodging tax through that agreement, and they actually generated $350,000 this fiscal year with that agreement. So, thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Knuckles. So just in summary, the recommendation in front of you this evening is the same that Planning Commission proposed to you in May. As Mr. Martin mentioned, if council wishes to have short-term rentals mirror the long-term rentals to allow unrelated guests to stay with related guests, you could include the provision on the screen. I won't walk back through all of these, but I just wanted to have it close at hand in your slide deck. This is the current recommendations based on Planning Commission. If council prefers to collect lodging tax on short-term rentals rather than require operators to pay a registration fee, an alternative would be to enter that voluntary collection agreement. And again, as Mr. Knuckles just said, we've warmed to that idea with the change and with the remission of sales tax to the Commonwealth. In that case, staff would propose to establish a registration program, and it would be a no-fee registration associated with that. The only cost would be the penalty for failing to register. Staff would then contract with a third-party monitoring service to identify the location of the rentals, and the Commissioner's Office would follow up with those operators that do not list on Airbnb to work with them to voluntarily remit their lodging taxes. And as previously mentioned, staff could also use the registry to address zoning concerns through that 3 strikes and you're out within 3 years. So in closing, we're here to answer any questions we have. I want to recognize all the folks behind me. This has been a collaboration of multiple departments who've worked together, not just in drafting the ordinance, but in preparing the responses to these questions. And we're happy to work with you on through this discussion. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you, Mr. White. Thank you to everyone who has prepared this presentation for us. So I will turn to my council. I see Councilmember Nelson has some thoughts, and we will kind of go from there. And then I see Councilmember Wright, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor. I do have some questions, and after we discuss it, I might have some additional questions. The first question would be with regard to Mr. Martin's presentation about owner occupancy. Is it correct if I understand that the ordinance will require that a short-term rental be owned by a natural person and not by an entity, company, LLC, trust, or otherwise, because of the problem of identifying who the owner is of a corporation or business?
I think, I wouldn't say it's requiring it, but it'd be very difficult for an entity to occupy a structure and maintain an occupancy there. If you and I formed Nelson Martin whatever LLC and we started purchasing 4 or 5 houses, we obviously couldn't maintain legal domicile in all 4 of those houses. So yes, it wouldn't prevent us from owning them, but it would prevent us from doing short-term rentals in them.
Okay, and that's the point, that it seems to me if it's not possible to have the owner occupancy in those areas where owner occupancy would be otherwise required, then the ordinance would implicitly require that it be owned by a natural person who does physically, in their own right, occupy it as their residence.
I believe that is correct, yes.
Otherwise, I can see it would be very cumbersome if the Nelson Martin LLC owned properties and we decided, well, we're going to rent them out.
We could not do that on a short-term basis.
Unless, and I'm just
We could
thinking
add
out-
people to the LLC.
You could add people, and I can imagine a situation where an entity may, as a part of the rental fee, have the short-term resident become a temporary owner of the business and then submit a damage deposit, and then if they want the damage deposit back, they have to surrender that interest. And then it gets very complicated.
It would be very difficult and I believe unrealistic. Maybe possible in theory, but I think that'd be very difficult to do.
So it seems to the conclusion one would draw is, in order for the ordinance to be enforceable with an owner occupancy, it has to be owned by a natural person, not a person as otherwise defined by our code, which can be a business entity.
I believe that's fair.
Okay.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that same point? Sure. I've seen practice, and you can speak to
I've
this,
seen
I'm
it.
sure. I've seen practice where developers will intentionally have a different LLC for each property they own. In that case, you've got a one-to-one relationship there, and you couldn't disprove. Is there a way to, and I'm not saying I'm for or against this provision. I'm just trying to figure out the technicalities of it. Can you define the term as a natural person? Is that I don't know if that's a legally definable term or?
Well, I think our code, city code, defines person as being not only a natural person, but any business entity.
It defines, a person is any natural person, firm,
Owner is defined as any person, and then it goes on to define person as a natural person as well as a variety of specified legal entities such as corporations, companies, or associations. So that if we use person or owner, we need to tailor it very specifically in the context of this ordinance and not our general definition of owners and persons that otherwise exist in the city code. Would that be correct?
I believe the end result is the same, but we could be more clear on it. Again, I just do not see how an entity or a corporation that maintains multiple ownerships is going to actually be able to maintain their legal residence in all of those structures.
Occupancy.
You just can't do it.
Okay.
Because but let's pick an entity. humankind, not humankind, I don't know, say an engineering firm, say Wiley & Wilson, that's not a good example now. They own and they are in their building, but they may have 2 or 3, BB&T, oops, that's a bad example. Bank of the James they own and they occupy, maybe they own and occupy a building, and they occupy 3 or 4 buildings. So that's the case where an entity has multiple occupancies in multiple real estate locations.
But they're not living in them.
So you can't,
Not a dwelling.
it's not a dwelling.
It's not a dwelling.
So that's the definition, that's the differentiator is dwelling. And a business can't have a dwelling. All right, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Thank you. Second question I had, and again, Mr. Martin, I think you addressed it. With regard to, actually, it was discussed by several, with regard to the exemptions for infrequent use. We have exemptions for yard sales, we have exemptions for a variety of fundraising activities where nobody is hired to go and inspect how often they engage in those activities, but clearly there's a limit on how many they can be engaging in a calendar year in order to qualify as not having to remit sales taxes and so forth. What's the difference here? Why can't we say, for example, 7 days in a year would be considered an infrequent use so as to accommodate those persons who, on graduation or other special occasions, would rent out their house to persons?
I did not cover that in my remarks. I believe that was covered by Mr. Knuckles.
He did.
I believe you could do that, but I'd rather Mr. Knuckles answer that
All right,
question.
thank you.
And you are correct. For nonprofits, like for meals tax, it's 3 occurrences a year. And normally those are advertised. I mean, so we hear about them or see them or Facebook or wherever we get our information. We know that's occurring. With these folks, I mean, we could definitely do it. It's just we have no way of monitoring any number of nights, whether it be 1 night or 10 nights. We really don't have a way to monitor that number.
Yeah, and I agree with you. We don't want to have the monitoring police running around counting how many times a person is using their house for a short-term rental. But I'm sure the neighbors would keep pretty close tabs on that, and somebody's going to call somebody. But I think in terms of the public relations and especially the number of colleges that we have here, there are times in the year we need a lot more residential space or a short-term space than we have available on a commercial market. And to say that we're not going to tolerate the once or twice a year would be a little bit onerous and not considerate of what we all pretty much need. So I would like to see that in there.
Well, I mean, I certainly think you can do that. There's no doubt you can do that.
Okay, thank you.
Could I ask a follow-up question to your question, though?
Sure.
So I think we could definitely do that, yet if you rented your house out infrequently, let's say less than 7 days, but if you advertised that on the Airbnb platform and we went into a voluntary remittance with them, they're going to collect the lodging tax up front. We have no way to exclude the lodging tax. What would happen is the lodging tax would be moved to the actual renter and not the operator.
Well, that's a good point as to whether or not there's a mechanism for someone to appeal to the city that Airbnb collected it from me. I only rented it for 5 days in the year. I'd like you to refund those 5 days of taxes back because I fell below the threshold.
If I could, that was really to be in lieu of the $150 registration fee. See, the lodging tax is not paid by the person not paid by the host. It's paid by the folks that stay there. So
Right.
in my opinion, on the agreement side, the collection of the tax is fine because it's paid by the person staying at the residence. The night's deal was
Right,
in
okay.
lieu of the
That's
$150
true.
registration fee.
It's like the restaurateur who collects the tax but doesn't remit it to the city.
Correct.
It's not their money.
That's correct.
It belongs to the city, and it came from the customer. Okay. Well, that's self-solving.
And if you went that route, there would be no registration fee, is one of the options that was proposed. So you could do it as many times as you wanted to.
That's the segue to my third question, and that is, why would we waive the registration fee if we collect the lodging tax and vice versa? Why wouldn't we do both?
Do you want to answer that? Or I think because at the time, Mr. Knuckles mentioned this in his remarks, at the time we were not comfortable with not being able to audit Airbnb platforms voluntarily remitting to know that they were actually remitting what they should. With the change in the state code that went effective July 1st, they're now submitting receipts to the state. Is that correct? And sales tax receipts, so they can actually compare those two numbers. The $150 fee, registration fee, was just a way to kind of recoup what staff time went into it, and that was based on a assumed 30 days rental at $70-some with the 6.5% lodging tax. So if you actually started collecting the lodging tax, you would not need to require a registration fee.
Well, is it prohibited from doing both by state law?
No.
Because to me, it seems like the registration, so as to know where they're operating and who's operating it, is one component of the overhead cost. And then the frequency by which it is operated is the tax that the motels and hotels, everybody else has to pay. Why would the short-term renter be exempted from that simply because they set up the registration? I don't see the logic there.
Yeah.
But
And again, the $150 was to cover the entire cost, but there's nothing to say that we couldn't charge a lesser fee than that. The $150, as we've noted before, fees are to directly offset staff costs, so we just can't exceed what we collect. But that number could be whatever you choose.
But the tax is for the activity that's going on, not the registration.
Correct. Correct.
And, okay, well, I'm more inclined to treat all of our overnight businesses the same in terms of that lodging tax. So, and related to that, back to my first question concerning the exempt or difficulty of enforcement, if we impose the lodging tax, and the argument is enforcing that would be difficult, collecting it would be difficult unless it's Airbnb. That logic presumes that whenever we have a law or a regulation or a tax, that we are able to enforce it uniformly against everybody. But we know that we don't do that. And the example I used last time was we have speed limits in the city in every piece of asphalt that a vehicle can go over. There are speed limits. But the fact that we don't have the means to enforce those speed limits everywhere and anyhow they can be enforced doesn't mean that therefore, since we can't enforce it effectively, we should abolish speed limits. We ought to have them, and then those who comply will comply, and the public will be better for it. And those who don't comply, we will see if we can enforce it against them through the wherewithal that we have. So that's why I would like to treat all the motels, the hotels, and the short-term rentals the same with regard to the lodging tax, but have the registration fee to cover the staff overhead to set up the registry. And I think we're treating everybody equally under the law if we do that.
I just want to point out one important piece, and I didn't cover it in my part of the summary, and I should have. One real benefit of the voluntary collection agreement, once we could get past the ability to audit those private funds or those collections, is that the operator does not have to collect it and doesn't have to go through the process of remitting it. The collection agreement, Airbnb would directly remit that to us. So it takes the burden off the operator, provides for more efficient collection, and ultimately, we think, higher collection. So that's a benefit that we think is really at least appealing to to talk through. So
If there is an Airbnb or a similar platform that makes the remittance.
that's correct. And again, as Mr. Knuckles mentioned, it's hard to tell from the dots on the map, but we think it's right now our operators are well over 90% Airbnb based on the spot assessment data we've seen so far. That reduces the scale of the ones that the Commissioner's Office would have to look at for other platforms.
But if we had a registry and a fee, and we didn't impose the lodging tax, then whatever Airbnb is willing to collect and remit is not going to happen at all, correct? If we don't have the lodging tax applied to the STRs?
That's correct. We could enter, the proposal would be to enter into the collection agreement with Airbnb, and then we would set up the registry to work with the other operators on voluntary remittance. We could still charge a registration fee. The collection agreement would not prohibit that. So.
Okay, all right. Thank you. That pretty much covers what's on my mind right now.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Wright?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I just want to make sure I understand what the three things we're being asked, I guess it sounds like we're being asked to weigh in on. And it's where can short-term rentals happen and how? 2, what's the reporting requirement? And then 3, do we require that they remit tax, or do we sign an agreement with Airbnb and potentially down the road other providers to have them collect and remit the tax? Am I getting those 3 things right? That's what y'all are asking from us today?
I believe so. There has been a question about the number of people, so if it's up to you. Again, our citywide occupancy requirement is 3 unrelated. This proposes 4 unrelated.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So do we have, I think one of the things that's sort of troubling me is the owner occupancy requirement in R1, R2, and what is it, RC? Do we have a sense of how many units there are currently in those zoned areas?
I do not, no, sir.
Okay. So
Do you? Spot data just gave us dots on a map.
just dots on a map. So it seems to me that if we were to do this and require owner occupancy, we could potentially be putting, as you all said in the presentation, potentially several hundred units in violation of city code, right? If we have owner occupancy requirements. So is that right?
Well, no, because I believe the zoning administrator's interpretation now is that in order to do it in those districts, it has to be owner occupied. So we wouldn't be putting them in violation of anything, because if they're operating it under his interpretation, that's the way it's supposed to be now.
So they're already in violation.
Right.
Okay. So how have other localities sort of approached I imagine there are a number of different ways to do this. How have other localities approached the owner occupancy issue so that you don't have hundreds of units potentially in violation?
I mean, we surveyed 28 localities. They were really all completely different. Some required owner occupancy in certain zoning districts. Some didn't require owner occupancy at all. I think that number, that hundreds, we really have no idea how many that the owner isn't actually living there. The hundreds I was referring to would be prohibiting them in residential districts outright. We don't recommend that. So.
Okay, so I don't know. I'm curious for the rest of council's input on owner occupancy. That causes me some reservation because I'm just not sure that this ordinance as drafted sort of addresses that concern. And I would also second Councilmember Nelson that I think that there should be, actually I take that back. We've already addressed that. An exception for people who lodge infrequently, but that's already been addressed. So thank you.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Hegelson?
There's lots of different parts here, so I think we should probably kind of, I think work freely on different parts. So, just I guess to follow up what Councilmember Wright just said, having, I guess first of all, stepping back, and I know it's easy to get kind of the minutia of all the different things, but we've just applied for wealth building grants in the city, and when you look historically, the best way to build wealth is private property rights. I mean, when you look historically, there was three things that allowed countries to flourish and localities to flourish by building wealth before the king owned the property. Once you actually had private property rights, and they used the Homestead Act, where people went out and had actual a piece of paper that said they own this. And we didn't interfere with what they do. Obviously, we have some, jurisdiction because we don't want a pig farm to influence your neighbors, but when they're doing something that's fairly basic, having private property rights and we as a government enforcing those and helping make sure those private property rights stay, that helps build wealth. When we have a free exchange, that helps build wealth. And the third one was a stable money, which obviously we have nothing to do with money in local government. But those first two things, so how we can really help build wealth is having solid property rights and not interfering on every little thing. Lots of things that we've talked about, it's kind of a pig in a poke. I mean, it's like, is this going to be good or is it going to be bad? Commissioner of Revenue just mentioned about the estimate for lodging tax. Thought there may be 100,000 in Alexandria, and guess what? It's 350,000. We just had a finance committee meeting this morning where we had extra money, more money than we anticipated in sales and use tax because the hotels were full. We also had more money in meals tax than we anticipated. And so the more that we can say, let's allow as many people to come here, even when the hotels are full. Come here, stay in Lynchburg. Don't stay in Charlottesville. If you're coming to graduation, stay here and figure out a best way we can do that without interfering on the neighbors, I'd grant it. So where they can come here, the people who own the property can feel good that they're making their money. With a free exchange, they're picking who they can have in their property and not. So the more that we go down paths of all these different things, would we have more lodging and meal, or more meals tax and more sales tax if we said you can't rent your house? Probably not. So what we can do, the best way is what we should try to, go down those paths. A lot of times when you think about lots of these decisions, the hardest thing to do is figure out the unintended consequences. As you mentioned about property. I mean, if you have to own it to rent it, what is that going to do? Who knows? I mean, there's a lot of negative unintended consequences that can happen with that. It can happen big picture. It can happen where we have, I know a while back, I've looked at several and met with several. There was one property that had complaint after complaint over by, before they bought it. Since then, property values went through the roof. Since then, the neighborhood was cleaned up. If we would have had some restriction that said, no, you can't do that, there would have been lots of unintended consequences that would have been the worst thing that anybody, we would all agreed and said, don't do that. Sometimes these things happen based on laws or policies that we put in. So the more that we cannot restrict and the more that we can protect the neighborhood, as I'm reading through lots of these things, there's different platforms and different things that happen at different times. But the more that we can allow our properties to flourish, because I don't think anybody up here wants to say, let's stifle it. We want to protect our neighborhoods. Over by a Point of Honor, that house over there, that went up 4 or 5 times in value. Had 11 complaints, not a complaint since. If we stifle this, that's going to be tough. I think there has been some good things the Commissioner of Revenue brought up as far as, and I think that addresses Councilmember Nelson's concern. If somebody's renting out their house once a year and you're part of that registry, one rental is going to have lodging tax. If you rent it out 365 times a year, that one is going to have lots of lodging tax that's going to be paid. So having a fee and then exempting because of, I think it exempts itself if you just have a flat lodging tax. I think the I think that's probably the best thing that you can easily go with, is to say, don't have a fee, just have a lodging tax with Airbnb. Everybody kind of agrees to it. You sign up to it. It's a pass-through. Everybody pays that. It's equal, other than if they don't use Airbnb. But with that, you don't have to go backwards and have all that work of saying, well, everybody's got to do it, but then we're going to exempt you because you only used it 7 times a year or 3 times a year. That would be extremely difficult. It'd be more, when I looked at some of these numbers here, there's more money to enforce than is going to be collected. It almost says, well, maybe let's not collect and enforce. We had 11 complaints, which granted in a city of 80-some thousand, it's not a lot of complaints, So I realize there's some complaints and there's some things there. But 11 complaints out of a city of 80,000 people, 25,000 individual property units, probably not the greatest number of complaints. So I would agree with Councilmember Wright on the not having the owner occupation, or having to be owner occupied. The other item, the 4 people versus 3, and I know you were going over that, Mr. Martin. The reality of it is it's a little apples and oranges. I recognize the number of people that are there, but if you're going to compare apples and apples, if there are 3 people that live in a residency and those 3 people have a guest that stays with them overnight, that number can go to 12 mighty quick without any violation of zoning ordinance, because it's domicile, it's residence. And so if those 3 people that live there have a bunch of guests, that doesn't change it. So going from 3 to 4, and I understand the purpose of, you're saying that you can allow more. I wouldn't even have it on that. The 4 is then limiting a whole lot more, because there is no limit on the 3, right? I mean, if these 3 unrelated people are renting a house, these 3 unrelated people are living in that house, and these 3 unrelated people had a party one night, and so then they said, well, why don't you stay here the night? We don't come in and say, hey, you can't stay here the night, because it's not a matter, we do have the ordinance that says you can't live there.
Yeah, I think the difference is that you're talking about one instance where they may have had a party and stayed one night. For short-term rentals, you're talking about it occurring 365 days a year. That's a
So
little bit
short-term
different.
rental, though, by definition, would be short-term. Short-term is not long-term.
Less than 30 days.
Yeah, so short-term would be one night. If somebody, as Councilmember Nelson said, if one person rents out their house, Liberty graduation weekend, one weekend, it's, so I understand the concern, but the apples and apples are vastly different, because if somebody's living there, they can have people stay there with them without violating a city ordinance if they're renting the place. So if somebody's going to say, hey, we're going to come here and spend the night, and there's 5 of us, I think that's an economic decision between the person who owns the property versus the person who's renting the property. Because if you're renting the property and it's my property and my house, I'm not willing to have 20 people come in my house that are going to pay me $77 to stay in my house for the night. I'm going to say, not a chance. I am going to do that, not government. I'm going to say, you can't come in my house with 22 people and a dog and 3 cats and a hamster, because this is my house and I care more about it and I'm not letting you in. So I think they're going to do better to protect their own property than government could think about how we can protect their property. So I think that would self-limit based upon their desire. But the difference between going from 3 to 4, I think, is easy. I don't think that stop, though, at 4 is comparing apples with apples. So those are, and I got tons of other things. When you look at the technology of the Airbnb, I saw the one slide where it's shooting up through the roof. And you think historically, back when I was a kid and we sold stuff, you had to go put a little thing on a telephone pole, a yard sale or whatnot. Now you got a technology. There are people from all over can find and search, and And so I think a part of that increase in the utilization of short-term rentals is driven obviously by technology, but what were the three things that you said, Mr. Wright? You said private property, I mean, not private property, you said owner occupied, 3 versus 4, or the number of people, and you said one more. Oh, the registration fee versus the lodging tax.
Yeah, I think there's that.
So I think I kind of addressed those 3, didn't I? Yes.
Councilmember Para?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I realize that there are significantly varied opinions, and I think that there are going to be a large number of them as we go around the table. I've got a suggestion for how we can whittle this down and funnel this down a little bit. I would suggest that we look at this list that the Planning Commission has proposed, and we go down each bullet and find out if we accept that, or if accept it as it is, or want to discuss it. I've already heard on the 2nd, 3rd, and 5th bullet point that those are items that we want to discuss further. So you put those all off to the side. But why don't we talk about the by right, the additional parking, and then the revoking their approval, and see if we don't have any other ideas about those, we could kind of, in effect, signal our approval of those, put those on the other side, resolve the issues that are outstanding one at a time, because that way we can each go through and we can talk about those issues that are important to us. And then once all the bullet points are decided, or guidance is given in all the bullet points, then maybe there are other things that council members would like to either add to it or some, just something that's not identified in these bullet points. So I think that may be a systematic way that you could go through and we can kind of whittle this thing down a little bit.
Okay, is there agreement on that being the way that Councilmember Wilder?
That's what I was trying to grasp everything. It's just so much. I was looking mainly at the Planning Commission recommendations as a starting point and kind of working with something, because it's so much. I think it'd be a way of at least addressing items and then going from there.
And the one may be good to address first is that registration fee or the lodging tax. I think that was presented pretty clearly. I think
I believe Councilmember Hero had suggested we I guess address the 3 that we have that haven't really already been brought up yet, and that might not be as objectionable to most members. So,
All right, let's start with if everyone's in agreement, the permitted by right in all zoning districts except industrial and institutional 1. Everyone okay with that?
so. What I don't even know what that actually means by itself. You know, a lot of things are kind of by themselves that I don't know if that's. You know, a lot of things are kind of based upon something else. So they're not just, you know, little snapshots of one. So permitted by right, so somebody can rent their property out on a short-term basis by right, except in a zoning. I mean, except in industrial zone.
What council should understand what that statement means by right. There may be other regulations that go along with it. But that means they could create this short-term rental subject to certain provisions without having to come to council for approval.
For CUP, like, so this is comparison versus a bed and breakfast kind of thing.
Correct. That's what that means.
Is there agreement that that can or should occur by everyone? All right. Next is limited to 4 unrelated guests. An unlimited number of related guests would be allowed. No, I thought he said to exclude 2. Number 2.
I think 2, 3,
Well, number 2,
5 are the ones that are.
2, 3, and 5.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. 2, 3, and
They're the
5.
big
Okay.
discussions.
Right, so 1 additional parking space would be required per short-term rental except in the B4 district downtown.
and so with that, I got to, you know, obviously that's our zoning ordinance on other elements, but, you know, as Councilmember Nelson said earlier, that when you have something that's, you know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, so to speak, you know, everywhere else you have to have an extra parking spot with except my, you know, whatever you want to call it, your favorite or whatever area. if it's going to be the same, it should be the same. It shouldn't be the same with the exception of you don't have to do it in a B4. So if you're adding and saying you got to put an extra parking spot at your house, well, you got to do it there too, or don't do it everywhere.
What's the rationale for not being in B4?
Downtown.
There's no parking requirement in downtown. And in other areas, there's no parking decks where people can pay to park or lease parking. Or is there space to create massive off-street parking lots?
How do you define that in a residential district? R1, R2, I mean, where people are parking on the street or in the driveway or in their garage?
In the residential districts, you're required one space per unit. That can be in your driveway, or if there is on-street parking, it can be on-street.
Cars could stack one behind another?
In a driveway?
Yeah.
Sure.
And so
As long as it's on your property.
it's on your property or in the street?
I'm saying the requirement, if there is on-street parking, it could be on-street parking or it could be in your driveway. Both of those would count in a residential district.
So how about Warwick Lane or Norfolk Avenue, when there is really no driveways to speak of? How would that be enforced then?
They would have to show how many on-street parking spaces are available.
So with that, that's why, again, I would let the market decide. When you're saying come with your 3 people to my Airbnb, but by the way, you can't park. You got to park your car at the, Hobby Lobby and take the bus here. I don't think many people are going to do it. So
You're not going to get an argument for staff in not having a parking requirement.
good. Let's remove it.
We agree with you. The market
Good.
should decide. There should not be a minimum parking.
That's
Anyway.
hard to enforce, but the number one complaint that I've heard from people is concern about the street filling up with parking.
Absolutely.
And I think that's just going to have to be, I don't know how to, all right, so the basis in which I'm thinking about these issues is unless there is a compelling reason otherwise, I'm going to err on the side of liberty. So this would be one of those ones I'd rather not restrict at this point, but if it had to come back in a year and we had to reevaluate, then maybe we reevaluate when we have some numbers. But at this point, I don't think I'd be willing to restrict it.
All right, other thoughts regarding striking the additional parking space? Everyone in agreement with that? Oh, Councilmember Nelson.
If I was a resident living next door to a short-term rental and there wasn't additional parking there beyond one space or so, I think I'd be pretty upset at City Council for saying there's no reason to accommodate the additional commerce that you were inviting into that neighborhood. But I also agree with Councilmember Perro and with staff that it's going to be very difficult to enforce. And in terms of how many cars are going to end up there with the 4-person limit, I cannot see that there would be, very many at all. So I don't have any objection to eliminating that restriction unless, but we could look at it later. As
And one house that I think about in particular, they actually own the house. I've heard from the neighbors. Their neighbor that owns the house have lots of cars. And they park on that street and they get so mad because their neighbor has got a bunch of kids and everybody's got cars and they park on the street and they fill up their, but they own the house and the neighbors own the house. So it's not, indicative of just a short-term rental. I mean, it's. Sure.
And just one other comment. Most of the streets that don't have driveways and parking spaces on the lot are permit parking. So in order to be on that street, the owner of the house is going to have some sort of permit parking for the person that's going to be on the street who's there as a short-term renter.
It'll be turned into a bike lane like they did on Ford Avenue and got rid of the whole parking spot completely, so.
All right, Councilmember Wright.
Yeah, I just add that I agree with what's been shared about the additional parking space. I think that given that this is our first attempt to, regulate an evolving industry, the lighter the touch here by the city, I think, the better, until we fully understand what the implications are. And then, in a year or two time, as Councilmember Pero said, once we have more information and certainly more feedback from neighborhoods, we can then tailor our approach then if we find that it actually becomes a problem.
All right. Thank you.
I guess just one
Councilmember
thing,
Haggis.
and I can appreciate that, but one thing is good, is to have clearly, if we're clearly defining things, let's clearly define for people that are in the Airbnb business that we're not going to, in a year from now, double the charges. Or a year from now, we're going to then, after they've invested a bunch of money improving their house, that we're going to now come back and say, hey, we're going to make you also build a garage. I think part of law and the policy is making sure we're protecting their private property rights as much as we can, and they have a clear, defined set of parameters that say, we're not going to keep on nibbling away at them, because then they're never going to improve the property to begin with. So I'd like to see, I love that one, I don't know if she's here or not, yeah, she is, improved this house that was worth $28,000, and after it was 211, 10 times, I said 5 times, it was actually 10 times the value. That kind of stuff greatly helps our city thriving and helps our neighborhood, so.
All right, so it sounds like we will remove the one additional parking space bullet. Next is the city may revoke unit approval for 3 ordinance violations related to the short-term rental in 3 years. Councilmember Nelson agrees with that?
I agree with that.
Any other conversation? Everyone agrees with that?
I don't
point?
agree with that, just
All right.
because the difference is, what we're doing is now making it something arbitrary. What we've done is now we're saying, hey, voluntarily go on the Airbnb platform, voluntarily submit the, agree to pay the lodging tax, but now we're going to say, hey, if you did something that we don't even know what, we're going to now revoke your ability to do it. Because we haven't granted them the ability to do it, because it's by right. So I don't know how we can ungrant something that is by right, because somebody may have complained. So, I mean, to me, that's kind of the devil in the details on that one. I don't know how in the world you could actually revoke their ability, because if they had 3 violations, well, 3 violations of what? It was one, it was by right. Obviously, if there's noise violations, that's not a short-term rental violation. That's a city noise violation. If you haven't mowed your grass, that has nothing to do with short-term rentals. That has everything to do with your landscaping and weed ordinance. So if you had gutters falling out, that has nothing to do with short-term rentals. That has something to do with something different. So I don't know how what kind of 3 things would be a violation?
So any 3 violations of state or local laws or ordinances or regulations as relating to the property. So it could be gutters falling off, it could be grass that's not mowed, it could be all of those things.
And so that's why I wouldn't put that in there, because there's already mechanisms that handle that if you don't mow the grass and the guys come and mow the grass, they give you a $250 bill and they mow your grass. Great. It's already a system of enforcement. So I don't know how adding another thing on, you're revoking your ability to do something different because we put it under there. So.
All right, can I go to Vice Mayor Dolan?
Well, let's be clear here. Short-term rentals is a business, and I believe we have ordinances for other businesses. Why can't we have an ordinance for this in terms of how they behave?
Councilmember Para, followed by Councilmember Nelson.
Okay, that's it. That's all you're.
That's all
All right. Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I agree with Mr. Hegelson on this to some extent. I think that's going to be really hard to implement. If because somebody's just going to relist with Airbnb, what we're going to do is pull their listing with Airbnb or complain to Airbnb. I don't know how you can enforce that. So maybe that's changed so that there's a fee associated or a penalty as opposed to revoking approval.
Mr. White, do you want to respond to that?
So the intent of this is related to the operation of the short-term rental. So a noise complaint when you were operating as a short-term rental could be deemed as that violation. But the more enforceable ones, the ones that are more reasonable, are things like parking, which we just removed, but you can see if you didn't have the parking space that was required. Whatever your occupancy number is, frequently violating the standards that are set forth in the city codes as it's operated as a short-term rental when you have multiple guests present. It only applies during that operation. So if we investigate it, find that it's founded, and you had 3 of those within a year, or within 3 years, excuse me, at that point, what you would do is you could potentially revoke the operation of the short-term rental, and if it continued at that point, it wouldn't be pulling the Airbnb listing, it would be going to court, just like we do for any other zoning violation. And in that case, it would be, we have these documented violations. The thing for us that's so difficult is when we go out to enforce an occupancy complaint, somebody stays over the weekend, it's really hard to prove those things all the way through. And staff gets caught in a loop because the process deems that you go through that tremendously long process to do it. Having something where you could just write a notice of violation, it still provides for due process, makes it easier to enforce for staff, and I think probably provides greater clarity for the thing. But I do want to clarify that it is only related to the operation of that short-term rental, so it's not property maintenance concerns or anything like that associated with it.
What do you think about a fee?
I'm sorry?
What do you think about a penalty or of a fee as opposed to
Again, and obviously we deal with this a lot, state code allows you to prohibit the use based on 3 violations. It doesn't provide for a fee.
state code? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Allows you to prohibit a use.
Yes, sir.
Right, that's a key.
Yes, sir.
I guess, but with this, though, it is back to some of the, and I recognize you said property management things, and you said not, so we got a difference right there, but, so, for example, if it's based on the use, and let's say somebody rents it out 10 times a year, okay? And one of those times a year is not one time a year that paint happened to start just right then peeling. So, or those gutters happen to just fall that very day. You can understand noise of the party. Again, that's under a different auspices. So I don't know how you're going to say, hey, it's based on that specific rental,
And it's again,
I'm going to have to disagree with you because what the ordinance as written says is 3 violations of state or local laws, ordinances, or regulations as relating to the property as offered for short-term rental. It doesn't say it has to be in relation to the property as it's being used for a short-term rental. It just says property. The reason that was put in there was to give the existing neighborhood some level of protection. And all we've been talking about tonight is deregulating what the vice mayor said was a business, making it easier for them, but we are doing nothing to protect the existing neighborhoods. So that's why that section was put in there expressly, was to give some level of protection to the neighborhoods that are out there. We're talking about removing the ownership requirement. We remove the parking requirement. We're talking about adding more than 4 unrelated people. Where's the protection for the neighborhood like the comp plan says? I would hope you would think about that.
And I guess with that, that's why it kind of looks at the big picture. The big picture that said we've had 11 violations last year out of 25,000 properties. 25,000 properties times 365 days a year is a lot of ability for things to happen. And in 25,000 properties, 365 days for 1 year, there were 11. That's
But
pretty darn good.
the 11 was related to the 345 or 400 rentals, not 20,400 and some.
Yep. And so with that, I don't think we have lots of problems, and you're saying protect the neighborhoods. I think a lot of the things are already there are protections of neighborhoods, and there's actually improvements to neighborhoods. And so when you look at also, and I realize we can throw out little words and say, well, it's a business. Well, so is the long-term rental. I mean, if you rent it out for 365 days a year, that is a business. It's not a short-term business where, and because and quite frankly, the more that I've looked at this, the more I really would, I actually would pray that my neighbor's house would not be a long-term rental anymore. I would love nothing better than it to be a short-term rental, because this long-term rental is I mean, it's property values are declining, and you know, I would much rather have people that are coming from a long way away, pay more money, stay there for the night and go, you know, rather than having noise, rather than having grass growing up, and you know, so there's lots of positive benefits, and I recognize that we're looking at, and that's why I think what we need to do with all of these things is think about the unintended consequences that can happen. So,
Councilmember Nelson, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Martin, are you quoted an ordinance or a statute. Is that the state's enabling statute that you were referring to, or is this where you were reading from the recommendation of the Planning Commission?
I was reading from the recommended Planning Commission ordinance.
So this council could change that if we wanted to.
Absolutely.
And make the violations, 3 violations or however many we deem appropriate, to be tied to the STR ordinance.
Absolutely. My job is to make sure you understand what you're passing and the way it's written.
And that seems to me to be appropriate, that here's an activity which would be entitled by right, except of course in the industrial, but there are going to be some things that those owners are going to have to comply with that are in the short-term rental section of the ordinance, and we're talking about them right now. And if, to me, if there's a violation of any 3 of those provisions in the short-term rental ordinance, then it makes sense that the right to conduct that short-term rental, that right or that privilege is lost. That's the penalty. And I allude to Councilmember Helgeson has said, why are we nitpicking a host's owner's ability to rent it out just because something may happen that's a violation of the ordinance?
I don't disagree with what Councilman Helgeson said. If you're talking about grass not being cut and gutters and peeling paint, I am fairly confident that someone that is using these properties as short-term rentals are going to fix those, because in that instance they are self-regulating, right?
Absolutely.
But the things directly related to its use, noise, trash, those types of things, I could see those types of 3 violations. Yet that's not the way the ordinance is written right now. And if council wants to change that, we should change it.
I think it'd be appropriate to change it in 2 ways. One, that it relates to some criteria that's in the short-term rental ordinance that has to be complied with. And 2, if there's a violation of any other city regulation that occurs during the rental, the noise, the trash, the parking, whatever it might be, if it's connected to the activity that's going on, then that's what we want to protect the neighbors from. And so it's very much related to this, and I don't think the peeling paint is going to be one of the issues that somebody's going to raise. But when we talk about, a month ago, you were talking about landlords and evictions and compliance with the rental lease agreement. If somebody doesn't comply with it, the landlord is entitled to enforce the terms of the lease agreement that the tenant agreed to. In this case, if someone wants their house to be used as a short-term rental and they don't comply with the regulations that would entitle them to have that use in their home, or while it is being used, it's violating other terms of our city ordinances, I think it makes sense to take away that privilege, just like a landlord might take away the right to use their home.
And it's just, and that's a court proceeding.
The city would take action to revoke the use, and if the use continued, then through the zoning ordinance, we would have one case that would go through the court process.
So the owner, excuse me.
So if I were to have 20 people living in my house and the city was able to prove it, then you would take me to court and document and show, and if the judge ruled against me, I would lose my, I mean, the judge isn't going to make me not stay in the house. I guess I'd be fined or something like that. And that's how I guess that's how the short-term rental proprietor may be treated also, be fined or.
Right.
So maybe you're not revoking unit approval then, you're really just pursuing.
Right. The city would take action and say,
Okay.
we've
I'd be interested in-
notified you on 3 occasions. You've had 3 founded violations. The city is revoking your right as a result to operate the short-term rental unit. If it continued, it would then go to court to enforce that provision of the ordinance, if that makes sense.
Where I get heartburn is the revoking of approval. And I think that the suggestion you made about the revising that language or tweaking, I'd like to take a longer look at that once some language is available. Thanks, sorry.
And the benefit of that, as you pointed out, the owner, when they go to court, would have the opportunity to argue, yes, there may have been a violation, but it had nothing to do with the use while it was a short-term rental or anything else. So there's an opportunity for a due process.
Councilmember Hagelson?
I guess on that, it's, so they're renting out, hopefully they're renting it out to somebody that they really like and that's going to do a good job and going to be nice and clean and pay them their money and go home. And then they come and then they happen to get a bad person. And so now the person who did the problem, we're not going to hold the person who did and made the noise and made the trash. We're going to go on somebody else that said, hey, quit it. So that's where there's, I think, another problem too. We're blaming the guy who owns the property for the fact that somebody else who was the tenant that made all the noise and racket. So, but I guess just as Tom was mentioned ago, and I could greatly appreciate that, I overstated the numbers. 25,000 units. You said we're not talking about 25,000 units. We're talking about 529 units, right?
Is that the number now?
On slide number 9, it looks like 529 listings. So 529 listings, 365 days a year. That's only 193,000 possible iterations, of which we had 11 problems. So, with that, again, I think, so as Councilmember Perro said, the more that we can side on the liberty, I think the better. So, having this as just, carte blanche, and it's going to be administrative. I think that's what I'm, it's because anyway, I'd like to see us remove that.
All right, so is there agreement on removal, or is there agreement on the, did you have something before I started? Okay, or is there agreement on Councilmember Nelson's language of adding the 2 components of the discussion? And I know the first was of the short-term rental, if there's a violation of that component, and or if there's a violation of another ordinance related to the property, which Mr. Martin is saying. Did I
That's
summarize
2
that?
options. One, a violation of the terms that would qualify the property for short-term
Right.
rental.
Right.
And a violation that is related to activities or conduct that are occurring while it is being rented
At that
short-term.
Okay, all right, I'm in
So
agreement with
there's a
that,
nexus
those 2
between the
language.
2.
Right. Is everyone else in agreement with that, with the
And so that you're asking
exception?
them to come back with changed language and
Right,
stuff.
correct.
I'll be open to seeing something come
Let's
back.
see it,
All right,
yeah, let's see
okay.
it.
Correct. The staff, Mr. Martin, did you get that?
Yes,
Mr.
ma'am.
White? Okay, all right, thank you. Next, if you can go back to that, yeah, that'll work, thank you. Okay, that, puts us at number 2. The owner occupancy is required in the RC, R1, and R2 single household districts. Discussion on that, Vice Mayor Dolan.
I really believe that to maintain integrities of family neighborhoods, that I would support owner-occupied in those areas. And I think Jeff talked about unintended consequences, and I think that could go the other way too. And I know that there are a number of cities throughout this country that by changing neighborhoods into a number of short-term rentals that really destroyed the fabric of the neighborhood. So I think we have to be a little bit careful about unintended consequences when it comes to neighborhoods in those particular areas.
Thank you. Councilmember Wright?
Yeah, I'm just not, and I appreciate that point very much. I suppose I just wonder, you know, there, in the memo that city staff prepared for us, they said that if we were to make this a requirement, you know, it could potentially put well, I shouldn't put a number on it, a significant number of listings in violation, though they are, as Mr. Martin said, already in violation, but here we would be codifying that even further. And I just feel like there should be some, so I'm uncomfortable with that notion. I don't know what the answer is. Maybe it's you can only own a certain number of properties in R1, R2, RC. You know, maybe there's a middle ground that protects neighborhoods, but that also allows folks to have more than one property in these zoned areas.
Can I just, this was one of my concerns, was the owner occupancy, and one, the changing over the fabric of the neighborhoods. And I think I've been saying for a while, and I don't know, just in my thoughts of reviewing all of this over the months, in which it may not be fair, but for the owner occupancy piece, if there's a problem that occurs when a short-term rental is happening, who do we call? Is there an on-site call person per the property, like a 24/7 person that checks during the rental? You know, hotels have front desk managers that are there 24/7. Is that something that short-term rental could have, or in some other cities, or?
So not as proposed in this ordinance. I think Mr. Martin made that distinction that bed and breakfasts require on-site management. In this case, if we have a violation like that, we go back to the owner of the property and discuss it. So, but that's not a provision in this.
Okay, is that something that could be considered?
Having somebody on call, I mean, you know, basically if somebody's out at the property that you're renting, just think of examples, and then somebody's having a big party there, the police aren't going to come and arrest and find out who the owner is. They're going to arrest the person or find the person who was making a bunch of racket, right? And so having some on-call person of who the property owner is, it's based on that person that's making a bunch of noise and, you know, violating the law. So as Councilmember Wright said, having the owner occupancy requirement, and I would love nothing better than, I love when, back when I was on the CDBG, we pushed the language for owner occupied, I mean, people to own their houses. That's the best thing for neighborhoods, absolutely. But if somebody, we don't have to say that you have to live there, because we don't have that requirement if you're going to do a long-term rental. We don't, and so it'd be treating them very unequally. And, you know, I don't know how you can say for one, if you rent it for 30 days, you got to live there. For one that you rent it out for 365 days, you don't have to live there. That seems like would be more problems than the shorter term one. So I don't know how you can put in the owner occupation in there, or the owner occupancy in there, because it's, and it's going to put a lot of money. We had, like I said earlier, we had Finance Committee meeting, and there's a lot of people that stayed here when the hotels were full. And I'm glad they did, because we have more money in lodging tax, or meals taxes, more money in sales taxes.
Thank you, and I know Vice Mayor Dolan had, and I'm just bringing that up. I didn't know if we could, you know, going forward, it has to be owner occupied and then grandfather in, because I have a concern of the potential properties that could be, have other financial consequences for owners that have just bought it for that. So that's why I'm just saying, is there a room to kind of create?
I'll defer to Mr. Martin on the occupancy piece. He's
Okay.
certainly much more familiar. I will say, since we reviewed so many ordinances, I believe Charlottesville has a provision where they have to leave a number for a contact on site. So that, I think that's kind of how they got to some middle ground on that. I'm not saying that's the way, but that's.
But
those are options.
there's some middle grounds that some other city has come up with.
Yes, ma'am.
In a variation, okay. And I think, Mr. Martin, did you say in your presentation that because of our current regulations with our neighborhood planning document, there's some protection for neighborhoods not being turned over totally to short-term rentals?
What I referred to was one of the guiding principles of the comprehensive plan.
Okay, the guiding principle.
That's just kind of what the city said it was going to try to achieve in the next 20 years.
But we don't have a number set to that.
No.
Okay.
What I'm trying to find is where it's referenced the 100 units would be in non-compliance. That's been spoken about several times today, and I don't understand how that would occur.
Yeah, I think, so if it was in the memo, but I believe where I referenced the hundreds of units not being in compliance would be if we prohibited it.
If we prohibited them.
So, but.
Yeah.
If we said we're not doing short-term rentals. And what my point was, is right now, the zoning administrator's interpretation is that they should be owner-occupied in these districts. So if you kept this requirement, if you're operating legally today, no one should be out of compliance, right?
Right.
So if they're operating today and they're not owner-occupied in these low-density residential districts, they're already out of compliance, period. What Mr. White was referring to is if you just said, we're not going to allow them, right? Okay, just so we're clear on that. So the owner occupancy piece is not going to put anyone out of compliance. That is operating legally today.
But if,
decide whether or not to enforce the owner occupancy requirement. Right, that's.
Yes, sir, that's correct. That's one of the questions before you. Like say, staff just didn't recommend prohibiting it outright because suddenly now you have hundreds of people that we have to go back and enforce on. In this case, you set that standard and we work backwards through the ordinance over the course of the year prior to the July registration deadline to help people understand.
But essentially what it would do, right, I understand that people are already operating in probably non-conformity. Essentially what would, if we pass this, I suppose even if we didn't pass it, but conscientious Airbnb operators or short-term rentals operators would pull down their listings, right? I mean, if we decide to, either way, people who are law-abiding citizens will pull down their listings if we don't alter this language.
Yes,
Or could
I mean, I think certainly the code could affect people's business models on a number of different ways. So.
Do we have language on that also says if you're going to, I recognize this is for the short-term rentals, I focus on rentals, whether the time frame. So we have the same requirement that you can't rent or lease property in RC, R1, or R2? You have to owner occupy it?
For long-term rentals?
For renting it. So, I mean, we're now getting with a time frame because it made it easier because of technology. The old days, you had to do a lease or 5 years or whatever. Now, because we got technology and people move, great. We can rent it shorter. Okay. So is this language to say that you've got to be owner occupied if you're going to rent that out for a long-term rental?
No.
No. So this is
This is
just for short-term.
Strictly towards short-term rental, yeah.
And so that's where it's a big, it's not being treated fairly. So
I think
that's a
that
business too. I mean, that's a business.
well,
It's rental income.
I think you could state that. I think the difference is the transient occupancy that's coming and going potentially every day or up to 30 days, whereas in a long-term rental, typically they're there for a year lease or more, where they actually, the renters become known in the neighborhood. You're seeing the same people. You know who to go to. That was the thought behind it.
Now, I understand the thought behind it, but at 193,000 possible iteration, there was only 11 complaints, so.
Well, again, it was 11 cases, as Mr. White stated in the beginning of his presentation. There could have been multiple complaints, and it was combined into one case.
So we'll divide it by 33 then.
Okay, that's fair.
So-
Yeah, three divided by 193,000 is pretty small.
So, Councilmember Nelson, I'm going to defer to him, and I did have the question of, can we put a number to that amount of homes in neighborhoods that could transition over? Could it be, no, we can't put a number to it? Not like more than 10% on a particular street or anything like that? Okay, all right. Councilmember Nelson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think Mr. Martin answered part of my question, and that is, what is the essential purpose of the owner occupancy restriction? And the answer is to encourage relationships and neighborhood continuity and not have a highly transient environment. So essentially, to limit the number of short-term rentals. The other component of that, though, deals with contacting the owners if there's a problem. And I think the registration would solve that if one of the things that we ask of the owner is, where and how can you be contacted during the short-term rental if there's a problem, water problem, heating problem, some other issue? The owner's the one who has the authority to make the repairs or get the folks there to correct the physical problem or any other issue with their home. And if we don't know that, then the police who may show up or the fire department who shows up and the city itself has a problem. So that's easily remedied in the registration that occurs to see who's accountable. I'm inclined not to require owner occupancy because we don't require it with long-term rentals. And if it's perfectly all right for somebody who's not the owner to live there all year long, then what is, other than prevent transiency, why should we impose this on persons who want to engage in short-term? I think there's not an equal protection there in terms of having rules applied differently. So as much as if I were a neighbor, I would want that, I want to limit the number of short-term rentals in the house next door across the street. I think we've got to treat everybody the same, and I would say probably not require it as a condition to the ordinance.
All right, any more thoughts on that? Councilmember Wilder?
I think the conditional outcome do like it is, because with short-term rentals, it just brings more challenges. I think that's why it's there, because it brings more challenges than a long-term, if you're renting for a year, because of the relationships, because of people coming in and out. A lot of the neighbors in our neighborhood complain about, well, some of them complain about Airbnbs because of the parking, because of different people coming in, things of that nature. So I kind of like that owner-occupied piece there, because to me it's different than renting your house for a year versus a short-term rental, if that makes sense.
All right, Councilmember Wright, did you have something?
Okay.
Go ahead, Councilmember Perro.
Councilmember Para, okay. Councilmember Para. And I'm sorry to interrupt. It's 6 o'clock, and we are not going to discuss, we're pulling the capital improvement plan rating system because of this conversation, so I just wanted you all to be aware of the time and that we're pulling that. I just discussed it with the city manager, so. All right, thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no problem. That must have been telepathy. Hand signals and, yes.
Base coach.
This one is one that I really struggle with because I don't think it's appropriate to have businesses in residential neighborhoods, and especially I get concerned about people that are running short-term houses as businesses. I'm not as concerned about somebody that's doing it as a hobby or just has one, but if you have, but that runs straight into conflict with people who are welcome to have a business in long-term rental. So it's a very, very tough one for me. I would say that owner occupancy should not be required in R2, and I'm having trouble why it would be required in an RC district. I think, Dan, you're talking about a house in the woods somewhere on a steep side of the hill, so it may not be necessary at all. And if anything, I may be able to be talked into R1, but I'm going to tend to think that, and agree with Mr. Nelson, that we need to be consistent and that it would not be required.
All right, is there any more thoughts regarding number 2? So, no more thoughts? I'm still, Vice Mayor Dolan?
I still cannot support having the non-owner occupancy in RC and R1. And again, it goes back to the whole idea that a long-term rental, a year, provides more stability in the neighborhood with the person that's there. You see coming and going the same day. My concern is that young folks and families who bought homes in neighborhoods hoping to raise their children in a neighborhood that was stable, they know all the neighbors, and then all of a sudden somebody has a short-term rental here and another one here, and you have transient people coming in and out. And I can tell you, I had the situation in my neighborhood, and that's probably why I'm so passionate about it, because there were multiple incidences, and it was really, I couldn't walk my dogs without 4 or 5 neighbors getting on me and talking about how horrible the house was across the street. And they were in violation, and it was hard to process, and I know what you all went through to try to resolve that issue. And they were listed on Airbnb, and even after they were contacted, they still continued to be listed on Airbnb. But so my whole thing, and I'm just adamant about, for certain neighborhoods, that we protect the integrity of those neighborhoods for the families that are trying to raise their children in a stable environment. Thank you.
Now, offer a suggestion, since this is a sticking point. If you feel so passionately about that, why don't you make a motion of that and just see the motion to support that item, and then that would be the direction from the staff. I don't know if it's going to pass or not, but that would resolve that, at least that specific question.
Well, then I'd like to make the motion that we include the owner occupancy in RC and R1, R2, single household.
I'll second that.
Councilmember Nelson? Thank you, Councilmember Wilder.
They can talk about it first, it's a motion.
Would your motion include the qualification that any non-conforming, if this ordinance is enacted, those who now would be out of compliance, there would be no enforcement against them as long as they are the owners?
Correct.
So they're grandfathered in.
Correct.
For the current status?
Correct.
That would be my concern.
Because I can just see the unintended consequences of this if we continue to impact neighborhoods this way.
So that would be part of the motion?
That would be part of the motion.
Right.
And part of the motion, they would be grandfathered in, the currently, okay.
So, but grandfathering is the opposite, is what he's going to say.
You know, I understand what you're saying. I think you're trying to get to a point. Yet, if you're going to do that, I think that's a way to satisfy some people that may not be following the ordinance today, and that's fine. Yet, if they are doing it, then they need to come in and show us that they're doing it today, or immediately after you adopt the ordinance, so we'll know where it is. Because a year or two from now, we don't want to have to be trying to prove or disprove that they were operating it prior to the adoption of the ordinance.
Right, and if I may,
Councilmember Nelson?
the requirement for registration is completely different from the element of owner occupancy. We're not grandfathering the right to continue doing what they're doing and not comply with our short-term rental ordinance. We're just saying they don't have to be owner occupied,
If it's occupied today.
whether it is or is not.
Well,
If
I
it's
believe Vice Mayor Dolan's motion was to keep the owner occupancy requirement, and I thought your thought was...
Yes, I'm sorry. But if they're not owner occupied today,
You'd like to grandfather them in.
that would be grandfathered in, but they're going to have to register and comply with all the other
I
requirements.
think we're saying the same thing, but what I'm saying is we need to know that they're actually operating today.
And they'll have to register.
So they can say, we did it beforehand, we were doing it beforehand.
Right.
And show that they were actually doing it before.
And so with that, I mean, one, that is going to be a mess, for one.
Probably.
Yes,
but-
exactly. It's going to be a complete mess. Secondly,
get through it.
you're artificially limiting somebody's property rights, and now, so because of the fact that they could do it long-term, they can't do it short-term, and you're going to have to keep separate lists and books, and then you're going to say if you sell the house or you're not doing it today, but your neighbor can. I mean, how is that equal protection under the law? You can do it and you're my neighbor, but I can't do it because I didn't do it 3 weeks ago. That is, the reality is we have to say, do we care about people's property rights? And they can have a long-term lease, but you can't for some reason have a short-term lease. And I recognize that people say, well, we've heard about the transients. And Mary Jane, I appreciate your perspective. My perspective is absolutely 180 degrees the other way. I honestly, wholeheartedly wish I had an Airbnb next to me rather than a long-term rental. And we're saying, oh, it's so bad because of transients that are coming in and we don't know who they are and whatnot. I would love to see somebody pull up, being dropped out by a limousine, renting that house next door, even though I don't know who they are. I mean, so let's look at really looking at people's, rather than just throwing out stuff that says, oh, well, we're got to protect them or whatever. So there's, when we're looking at the very little number of complaints, when we look at the fact that, how many of these complaints were owner-occupied, by the way? So of the 11 complaints, times how many ever complained at the one complaint, owner-occupied elements of those 11.
Do you remember that right now? We can get that information.
Yeah, I mean, so regardless, it's probably, even if it's 11, 3/4 of them, so 8 of them, so 7 to 8 of them, but we don't have that on long-term rentals. So it's going to make a mess. It's going to now have a really difficulty to enforce. It's going to give different people different rights to their property that are neighbors. I don't know how you do that.
Councilman, thank you. Councilmember Wright?
Thank you. I just wonder if there's maybe a middle ground here, and I don't know whether it's legally permissible, but to limit, I wonder if we can limit short-term rental operators to having a certain number of properties, so you can only operate, say, 3 or 5 units in R1, R2, and RC districts. And maybe that's a way, so you're still going to, you're going to know who the owner is. They're not going to be necessarily, entirely unknown to the neighborhoods, and they can only have a certain number of units. I don't know if that's permissible under state code or not.
I think that probably not. I think that that's something we can discuss with the attorney's office. Yet, if I was going to do that, I would just create a separate LLC for my other 5 or 10. So,
And then too, if it's somebody who's doing it well, you want more of them. If they're doing a great job to an improvement to the neighborhood, like the one I mentioned that improved the value of the property 10 times, we want more of those, I think. So I'd like to see them develop more of them, not less of them.
And I was just going to have one more point.
Go right ahead.
Which was just quickly that I think whatever we do, we probably want to have a grace period for operators, just because, and I'm sure you all are well aware that they've already booked a year out. So we would just want to make sure that's built in.
Okay, thank you. And the only thing I'm not understanding is how it would be a mess registering these if we decided to go with the grandfathering, because we've already been running a registration system. So I'm just wondering where the mess would come into it as it was stated or
I
explained.
guess we don't know what we don't know, but it will be, we will have to get the third-party data, see where they are, and then we'll take the owner's registration information that comes in that tells whether it is or not. The tracking it going forward could be something, and again, a little bit of this will be, we just have to start down. it's probably not as clean as everybody would like, so it's,
Right.
but,
Okay.
but again, we'll try to do the ordinance that you put forward, so.
Okay, so there is the motion on the floor by Vice Mayor Dolan with the additional language that Councilmember Nelson discussed about the grandfathering in of those properties who would need to register in a time limit. And do we establish that time limit in this motion or after the further discussion? Okay, let the staff establish the time limit and bring it back to us. Councilmember Wilder had to step out a minute, so is there any further discussion? Councilmember Nelson.
Yes, just one comment. By using, and I'll use the term grandfathering, by grandfathering or exempting those that already are not owners who are occupying,
Right.
we know that as we go forward, the pool of houses is going to shrink. As they sell their house, they're going to then either have to be occupants of the house or it won't qualify. So the problem, that class of those is going to be reduced. And anytime you start something new, it's always difficult. It's always difficult to start, whether it be when Virginia started vehicle inspections or anything else. It was a change. But you got to start somewhere if it's a good idea, and I think this is a good idea.
Good compromise.
So why would, so that I think would be actually a whole nother level of discussion. It's not necessarily based on who happens to own it. I mean, zoning is not, I mean, I can own the house or Tom can own the house. If it's zoned R4 or R3, it doesn't matter who owns it. It matters that it's zoned the way it's zoned. So if we now have somebody who in this house that does Airbnb or short-term rentals, and then they sell it, I mean, typically it's not the person. It's, I mean, the zoning follows the property. It doesn't say, oh, you sold the property, now you can't do this anymore. CUPs go, you know, I mean, so I don't know how you could just automatically assume that that pool would be shrinking. And two, it'd be shrinking if you don't like it. And so if we think this is a good thing for the city, if we like the fact that property values have increased for those that we've seen that have done it, if we like the fact that we get more money in our lodging tax and meals tax and sales tax, if we like those things, let's try to have more of it done, and more of it done well, not, you know, try to minimize those 11 complaints, rather than saying, hey, we don't want any of it. So I think it would go with the actual property.
May I respond?
Councilmember Nelson?
I think Councilmember Helgeson has raised a very good point, but I would point out that zoning is not just property, it's use of property. And we classify the properties based on what the uses are that will occur on that property. And what, as I understand it, what, and I use the term generically, what evil or undesirable activity we're trying to prevent is transiency in neighborhoods that we believe and want to be coherent and stable and have people who are engaged and invested in that neighborhood. So having it able to be owned, the owner not living there increases the transiency tendency. So that's why, that's what we're trying to prevent.
All right, thank you for those comments, and Councilmember Wilder's back, and so right now I'll call for the vote. If there's,
Any comments?
oh, did you have any comments?
Okay.
Okay.
But you had another.
Did you have another
I was
comment?
going to do a procedural motion so that we could move on until he got back.
Oh,
so,
okay,
yeah.
no, thank you. So Councilmember's back, so I'll call for the vote. The vote is the Vice Mayor's vote of having owner occupancy with the additional language. Councilmember Nelson suggested of grandfathering in and registration of those who would need to be grandfathered into this, and staff giving the time frame period. So,
The clarification?
yes.
I did not hear R2 mentioned in the motion. Was it your intent to mention R2 or not?
I did mention that,
No, you did not.
Oh, I did not? Okay.
Those
Or did you-
Oh, no, I didn't. RC and R1. Yeah.
Okay, I just
Sorry.
want to make sure that was the intent.
So just RC and R1?
RC and R1.
Okay, just in RC and R1. Is that?
That's right.
Okay, making sure. All right. Please cast your vote. And the motion passes 5-2 on number 2. All right? So now we're at number 3.
So what do you want to do with R2?
Yeah, okay.
I assume that means R2
No,
is
you strike it.
not, it's Okay, owner occupancy is not.
There's not a requirement. All right. Okay, now we're at number 3, limited to 4 unrelated guests. An unlimited number of related guests would be allowed, but no unrelated guest may accompany them. So limited to 4 unrelated guests. An unlimited number of related guests would be allowed, but no unrelated guests may accompany them.
So the nanny can't come with the 6 children, you know? I mean,
Yeah,
it's,
that's
you got
right.
lots of things. And again, all these unintended consequences of all these things that is like, we're making criminals out of people that don't need to be. They
Staff
brought
agrees.
Maria Von Trapp with them.
Staff agrees that we should add the language of +1.
Plus one. Okay. All right, so I've got a question for Mr. White
Councilman
related
Rivera.
to this. How does this work for short-term rentals in vacation destinations? I would have said Bedford County and Smith Mountain Lake, but I doubt they're regulating this. How about Virginia Beach? Because you've got let's say a 5-bedroom house in Virginia Beach that's being rented for a week. How is this handled, and how's this? Can we develop some commonality between the two? Because if I've got a 4-bedroom house, then and a family that's coming in, and we're going to have a golf outing or a couples getaway, I'm in violation.
I mean, so I'll just tell you, it really is all over the place. It's like long-term occupancy. Almost every locality does it different. I think Mr. Irwin sent a survey out a while back of local governments that talked about the number of related and unrelated people local governments allow long-term. Short-term rental really looks the same way throughout Virginia. You have localities that go as high as 10. You have some that limit it down to 2. So it really is just across the board.
And I think the biggest thing would have to be kind of what the market would bear. I mean, because it's not, so let's say they have 5 people, or let's say we do this and there's 5 people. And now by the time, the zoning administrator gets out there to look at something, that people have already left, or they didn't bring their birth certificates, or lots of things that are going to be like, they were here, they rented it for 2 weeks. You're going to have a 23andMe DNA sampling so lots of things that there's no way you're going to look at this. And so let's have laws that are real, that aren't making good people bad because they're now violated something. I don't see how you could do that, and even having it at 4, because we're staying over at the Hilton, but we're just over here with them for an hour for dinner.
Thank you.
Todd removed that.
Vice Mayor Dolan, thank you. Councilmember Helgeson. Vice Mayor Dolan?
So I'm wondering if this couldn't be regulated by the owner of the property. If they have 6 bedrooms. I mean, usually when you rent a place at the beach or other places, the owner of the property says 8 guests or whatever. I don't know why that can't be regulated.
Because they're going to do it on their Airbnb site or whatever the
Right,
site is, and if
right.
it's a 1-bedroom, I don't think 12 people are going to be coming.
I mean, I can't imagine if you have a 2-bedroom home, you're going to have 8 people come in.
Yeah,
but-
exactly.
Mr. White?
I just want to say, so the occupancy standard citywide
Okay.
is 3 unrelated. So in effect, it defaults to 3. If it needs to be something different, then that's where council comes in and sets it. Just like Mr. Martin showed you for bed and breakfast, we defined it by rooms, we defined it lots of different ways.
But keep in mind, though, as I mentioned earlier, the occupancy standard was based on people living there, not having a guest for the night. If somebody has their girlfriend sleep over or something.
But please remember, in 2016, when you adopted the new zoning ordinance, besides chickens,
Right.
your number 1 discussion was about the number of occupants in a unit.
That's true.
And historically, what has happened in the city, and I can't remember the dates, but the city actually reduced its occupancy standard to no more than 3 unrelated. And now we're talking about, even if it's owner occupied, but in the R2, which is a single family district, have at it. This number of people per bedrooms was discussed during the zoning ordinance changes, and council ultimately chose not to do it for long term. If I was an astute property manager, then I would just convert all of my rentals to short-term 30-day leases or less than 20-day leases, and I would start renting them to 6, 7, 8 college kids, which is the #1 complaint that the zoning administrator gets. So I just want to point that out so you understand what you're discussing.
All right, any fresh thoughts after that? Because I was here during the chicken discussion and this one of the unrelated guests.
Maybe staff could come back with some alternative suggestions. The null option is one, okay? Room count, doing it by room count would be another. The PDC, the Planning Commission recommendation is another. The staff adjustment is another. And maybe there's another one the council would like to, and then we could look at lift those out and look at the pros and cons of those. And obviously that's not going to happen this evening, but something that we could look at what's best, because I think, Mr. Martin, you're bringing up some good points. I'm thinking we're running out of gas up here.
Yeah, let's.
And again, we would only know all of this if there was an issue, basically. Okay.
What were the limits?
Yeah, the
What's
limit of who's related, who's not related to each rental. Okay. Any other thoughts around that, or are we okay with Councilmember Pero's suggestion of letting staff come back? They've been very thorough. The information that you've given has been very thorough tonight. So I just want to make sure of what we're asking you to come back with. Those options he mentioned. Mr. White.
I'm sorry. Maybe Mr. Martin understood the staff adjusted limit. I didn't catch
Sorry,
that
that
one.
would be
I think that was the
4
related.
+ 1, was it?
Well, related plus one is what I
Okay, great. Thank you.
Related
So
plus one.
what I'm hearing is that council has, as staff has discussed this a lot this evening, they would like for us to come back to a future work session with some options for council to decide on the number of occupants in a short-term rental, both more than 4, maybe some less than 4 with the related plus 1, and council can discuss that. It seems like everything else has been decided except the number of occupancies and maybe the lodging tax.
Yes. So, yeah, I'm thinking just pros and cons, because you've
Understood.
listed out several.
Okay.
Or if there's
But-
a way to do it based on, like you put on here, based on the rooms, you know.
I mentioned that
it's
one.
okay.
You mentioned
And I
rooms while
mentioned the
you were
null
out.
set.
And I think, as Mary Jane had stated, it's kind of based on, you don't rent out necessarily a 2-bedroom, because a lot of things are not just the bedrooms, it's the square footage. And obviously, we're not going to say if you got a 5,000 square foot house, you're going to only rent out to 3 people. So that kind of a policy is a cookie cutter that says for everywhere. I mean, we got trailer homes living in Lynchburg. We have mansions in Lynchburg. We got some that are 10,000 square feet, so you can't treat them the same, and that's why the market kind of dictates how many people they will let and how many they won't, so.
So do you all have enough to come back with us from this discussion right here? And Vice Mayor Dolan had something to add.
Well, yeah, because I was really focusing on the unrelated. There's also, in addition to that, you have for unlimited number of related. If you read.
Right now, it could be unlimited related.
Unlimited related
Right.
and, okay, 4.
Right. So the staff will come back with us, and if you all have all that understanding on that point. We are at the last point. All units must register and pay an annual $150 fee.
Strike that and go with the lodging tax.
Airbnb. Yeah.
All
Yeah,
right.
for Airbnb.
Is everyone in agreement on that? I just wanted consensus. All right. Oh, Councilmember Nelson.
As was very validly pointed out, the beginning of the process is going to be challenging because of the work with regard to registration. I think the registration fee is appropriate. I'm not saying it needs to be $150, but a calculation to cover the cost the city is going to incur to establish this registry and have the lodging tax down the road. I think There's no reason not to have a combination, in my mind.
Let's just not do the registry, then we don't have to pay the fee. And they don't have to keep up with it. They just get the check deposited from Airbnb every week or every month or whenever they're paid without having to do anything.
Assuming they use Airbnb, they may not.
Well, yeah, but that's 96% of all registrations are based on Airbnb platform. I don't, and if you keep in mind, just it wasn't long ago that we got rid of some business license fees because of the fact that it cost a fortune to keep up, to file, to do, to whatever, because it was a de minimis. Your very beginning arguments were about having, if somebody has a de minimis, they don't have to do this. Well, let's just assume it's going to be de minimis from the beginning, because I don't think 529 people are renting out their Airbnbs every day. I think you had estimates of 30 days, and, you know, so having them go every day, you know, so anyway, the fees, I think, most of them are going to be small. And we gave back the money. We said, you don't have to file a fee because it costs the Commissioner of Revenue more in mailing, more in sending, more in collecting than the money they got.
To the extent it's a deterrent to be operating businesses in residential areas, I think it's appropriate to have a fee. But that's one of 7.
But I thought you had the business argument with the long-term rentals. I thought you recognized that they're the same. They're both rentals.
Right.
A rental business, if I'm filing my tax return, I'm filing the SIC code that says I'm in the rental business. If I rent it for a week, or if I rent it for 6 months or a year, I'm property rental business. I think they're both businesses.
They both generate income. The question is, what is the impact on the neighborhood, the residential neighborhood?
Thank you both. Councilmember Wright, and I just have a comment after.
I just second Councilmember Nelson's recommendation that we do a combination of both, some fee that satisfies however much the city has to expend to establish and maintain a registry, and then remitting lodging taxes. I think that makes, that's appropriate.
All right. Any further thought on that? Is that, I hear a motion. Councilmember Nelson, are you putting that?
If it's necessary, if staff wants to have a show of hands, then I move that we have a combination of the two, and a calculation of the fee should be based on what the projected cost would be.
Second.
All right, the motion has been made and second. Is there any further discussion? If not, please cast your vote.
Sorry, no, I'm thinking.
Oh, you're thinking?
It's me.
Okay.
Well, we got to vote again.
Well,
Oh, why?
Yeah, because I didn't.
She cleared it.
all right. So please cast your vote. And the motion passes 6-1. Thank you. And staff will come back with what that amount is. All right. So thank you. We have gone through all of the points for the short-term rental. And thank you. Ms. Severcek.
Two, and I want to make sure that the grandfathering in does not transfer with the sale of the property,
Oh, correct.
correct? Okay.
I mean, you got to figure out how to sell that rascal. I mean, because it's zoning goes with the property.
I think it does transfer property if the property owner that now buys the property continues to use it.
Absolutely.
As
I mean,
an
that's
Airbnb.
just, I mean, we're
does.
doing lots of things that are very anti-property rights here today.
It would transfer, if it ceased to operate for 2 years, then it would go away.
Okay.
Flying by the seat of our pants on
So if it's, see, did you hear that? Everyone understand that piece?
I mean, there's coming back with it to give the final ordinances, so,
Okay.
I mean, none of that was final, I would hope, and I would hope.
All right. Thank you very much for that discussion tonight. Next is roll call for this work session. Are there any announcements? Councilmember Wright?
I just want to wish the school system, I'm sure folks in the room will join me, wish the school system a happy first week of school.
Thank you. Councilmember Wilder?
Yes, we're excited again on the same note that our kids are going back to school tomorrow, and we are doing our annual Men to School where we are greeting our kids as they enter back into the school. We're going to be at the high schools at 7 o'clock and the middle schools at 7:30, and the elementary schools at 8 o'clock. So we're encouraging all men in our community to help come out and support them. We do have a few guidelines, but once you see a captain at the various schools, they can give those basic guidelines about videotaping and things of that nature and what we do with the event. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Nelson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The item I was going to mention has already been covered. I will just simply say and generously say I appreciate all of the thoughts and prayers and good wishes that are extended my way from council, from staff, and the general public while I was out in surgery last month.
All right, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Councilmember Pero.
No items, thank you.
Councilmember Helgeson.
No items.
All right, thank you. Vice Mayor Dolan.
Just be mindful of the school buses.
All right, thank you. I have a few. Congratulations to the Parks and Recreation for a feature article in National Parks and Recreation magazine entitled "The Ties That Bind," a new SIB shop program that provides support for siblings of special needs children. So congratulations to Parks and Rec for that. And thank you, and especially congratulations to all employees who assisted in the success of the State Games of America Main Games weekend. Special props to the city's tourism division and Parks and Recreation. This is a small but mighty group of employees who work tirelessly to exhibit the best of what the city has to offer. So also heartfelt thanks to Liberty University for its partnership with the city on this national event. Liberty's stellar facilities were a constant comment among spectators and athletes from all over the country, and even a few from out of the country, so outside of the U.S. Thank you for that. And we had a great national night out at Riverfront Park. I definitely want to thank all of our public safety personnel and all of those who planned that event for us. I did want to say I wondered if there is any room for having maybe a great event night out and still maybe tour buses to the neighborhoods. I just noticed there were less neighborhood actual watch member groups there, if I observed correctly. So it was a great night. I just wonder in the future planning if we look at maybe both, because I think they really appreciated having a bunch of us come out to the neighborhoods. For those that wanted to have events, not everybody wanted to have a dinner or cookout. Yeah. But just for those who want to have those nights out, I think it might be something to reconsider. And thank you to the schools who had a back-to-school event on Saturday. I did get through there, so for the planning of that and the purpose. And again, Lynchburg City Schools opens tomorrow, and reminder to everyone, as has been said, to be alert and slow down, particularly in the school zone. So thank you very much. We are dismissed until 7:30.